A guten Erev Shabbos. From now until the end of the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, will be the central human figure in the story. Except for one parsha, Moshe's name appears in each and every weekly portion from the beginning of the book of Exodus, Chumash Shemos, Parsha Shemos this week, until V'zois HaBracha, the portion which we will read on Simchas Torah next year, please God, in good health. V'zot HaTorah, we say, this is the Torah, Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael Al Pi Hashem. This is the Torah that Moshe placed before the Jewish people by God's command, Biyad Moshe, in the hand of Moshe. That's what we say when the Torah is lifted after the public reading of it, or in the Sephardic shuls before the reading. But do take notice that Moshe gets mentioned twice here, and God only once. It's okay, God can handle it. Because the figure of Moshe as teacher, leader, lawgiver, rabbi, intermediary for the Jewish people is so central, we're even called in some quarters the Mosaic faith. It's as if we believe in Moshe. Well, we do, sort of, as God's servant. In our morning prayers every day, and even in the Haggadah, we mention Moshe in the context of being God's servant. Via Aminu Bahashem, it says at the beginning of Shirat Hayam, the song at the sea, Uve Moshe Avdo. And in Moshe, God's servant. So let's take a closer look at Moshe's origins and early career in this portion of Shemos and deepen our understanding of Moses and leader as teacher. Torah is compared to light. Torah zu ora, says the Gemara in Megillah. And from the beginning of his life, Moshe and light go together. Rashi explains that the house that he was born in filled with light when Moshe arrived in the world, and by the way, his mother Yocheved gave him the name Tov or Tuvia, or maybe Tovia, because everything was good with him when he was born. Midrash Rabbah on Bamidbar says that she was worried because he was premature. So when he was born healthy, obviously that's the first thing that a mother pays attention to. Tov is good. Tovia means God's good. And as Me'am Loez explains, one of Moshe's chief elements of goodness was, in particular, goodness towards others, as evidenced by the verse later in the Chumash at the end of Parshas Ba'alaischa, where God calls Moshe completely trustworthy and the most humble of all people who ever walked the earth. How did Moshe work his way up the ladder of leadership of the Jewish people? He began as a shepherd, as our portion tells us at the beginning of Revi'i, the fourth Aliyah. U'Moshe haya roya es tzoin Yisroi chaisnai. Moshe was tending the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law. That's the time when Moshe encountered the famous burning bush and the voice speaking to him out of the flames, telling him to lead Bnei Yisrael out of Egypt. Believe it or not, there's a book in the Bayview Village Library in the business leadership section called Modern Shepherd, Leadership Lessons from the Desert. You should check it out if you're interested. It's written by a guy who was first an educational leader and then moved on to an MBA program at Harvard Business School. In the middle of his life story there, somehow or other, he winds up on a 10-day stint in the desert in the Middle East, taking care of a flock of sheep. He's got a shepherd supervisor, sort of a senior shepherd, who checks in on him periodically, but they have no common language. So he's pretty much left on his own to take care of this flock of sheep. He thinks, how hard can it be? As he learns over the course of 10 days just how much a physical challenge it is to stay alive in the scorching desert and to keep his mind on all his charges and make sure they stay hydrated and together and safe from snakes and other hazards. So this guy reflects on how Moses and other biblical figures were shepherds and concludes, not as easy as it looks. And actually, it is a pretty solid leadership challenge. To gain the trust of one single sheep, let alone an entire flock, challenges him to engage all the mental powers he can muster. So clearly, it's no small thing to be a shepherd. Midrash Rabbah tells the story of how Moshe went chasing after one lone sheep who strayed from Yisro's flock. This was a singular moment that proved Moshe's worthiness as a leader, never resting when even one of the flock was at risk of being lost. That same Medrash also describes Moshe's shepherding know-how. He used to stop the bigger sheep from going out before the younger ones. He would bring the small ones out first so that they could eat the tender grass that was more fitting for them, easier for them to digest. And only after he would allow the senior sheep, the older ones, to go and eat the ordinary grass. And after that, he would let the most energetic of the flock go out and eat the toughest grass that was left over. God sees Moshe's care and concern and ability, and he says, he who knows how to look after sheep and bestow upon each one the care it deserves shall come and tend my people. That's God's job evaluation of Moshe as shepherd. If there are any of us among us who have shepherding on our resumes, it'd be fascinating to hear about that at the Kiddush. Now, weigh that ability to judge and tend with Moshe's deliberation about the incident at the beginning of the next Aliyah, the jarring incident of Moshe's killing the Mitzri, the Egyptian who was beating up a Jew. Number of different opinions emerge as to what led Moshe to take the course of action that he did in killing this oppressor. The Torah tells us, Vayifen ko v'cho, vayar ki ein ish, vayach es ha-mitzri, vayitmenehu b'cho. Moshe looked this way and that, the Torah says, and he saw that there was no man, and he struck him down and hid him in the sand, hid his body in the sand. What was the nature of looking ko v'cho? He looked here and there, vayar ki ein ish. He saw that there was no man. On the face of it, it sounds like the Torah is just telling that Moshe looked this way and that and saw that there was no one around, so he killed the Egyptian. Rashi brings Medrash Rabbah as a source to say that it could mean that he saw what the Egyptian did in private and in public, out in the field to this Jew, and based on that he killed him. Others say that Moshe looked here and there, ko v'cho, he looked into the Egyptian's past and the guy's future, and he found no redeeming quality, so he killed him. Rashi's comment on the next clause, and he saw there was no man, fascinating. Rashi says, again, quoting Shemos Rabbah, that Moshe saw that there were not any righteous converts destined to descend from this Egyptian. Given that fact, Moshe took action against him, but had the situation been different, in other words, had it been that the man's future included the righteous converts, Moshe would have acted differently. Apparently, Moshe had quite a devastatingly effective method in his arsenal, in his toolkit. He uttered a name of God that would bring death to the man, but it would not cause the death of a meritorious person. Interesting. Your Art Scroll Chumash puts Moshe's choice in these words. It says, quote, Moshe's concern with future generations teaches us that one must consider all facets of a complex situation before acting. Had Moses' responsibility to save a fellow Jew resulted in the loss of future Jews, he would have chosen another course. End of the quote. The notion itself is very worthy of unpacking and discussion. We don't just look at the immediate situation in front of our eyes in Jewish decision-making. We also have to take into account this moment's impact on future generations, quite simply. Just one more point to note now. Let's go back to the very beginning, back to Moshe's upbringing, his childhood. At the moment when Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the water, which, if you recall, is how she came to give him the name Moshe, she said, "Ki min hamayim mishisihu," I drew him from the water. At that very moment, the boy's sister Miriam is waiting not far off at the river's edge. She very kindly offers to go and fetch a wet nurse from among the Hebrews, and Pharaoh's daughter, of course, agrees. Miriam brings the baby's mother, and all is well. The idea makes very practical sense. The princess, of course, had no means on her own to nurse the child, but why go to the trouble to go all the way out and get a Hebrew woman to nurse him? Because, as the note in your Chumash attests, this baby refused to nurse from an Egyptian. What's this? A baby racist? Rashi explains that either the baby, or could be God, as the note suggests, decided that it was not fitting that the mouth that would converse ultimately with the Shekhinah, with the divine presence one day, would drink impure milk. Sources of Gemara in Sota and a Medrash Tanchuma which say, shall an Egyptian woman be able to say, I fed the mouth that speaks to God? If you look into that Gemara, it seems that they tried to find an Egyptian nurse for Moshe, which is permitted according to halacha. However, Moshe declined to nurse from them. Rashi notes that a baby tastes what its mother eats, and even as an infant, Moshe was able to discern the taste of non-kosher food that the Egyptians ate, so he refused to nurse. It's preferable, those notes to the Gemara explain, that a Jewish infant nurse only from a Jewish woman who only eats kosher foods. In this case, Moshe was fed al taharas hakodesh, at the highest standards, as we've been discussing in our Talmud class the past few weeks, past month already. We've been discussing this idea of minimum standards and the idea that some people have a desire to elevate themselves above that minimum requirement and sanctify themselves, even with that which is permitted. We see from these few vignettes in Moshe's early life that not only the circumstances of how he was raised, but also how he dealt with them, all contributed to the depth and quality of his leadership, which is going to be the subject of the rest of the Chumash. Humility, kindness, perhaps some of it inborn, much of it nurtured, no doubt, by being raised as a foster child, albeit in Pharaoh's palace, was one point. A child in such a situation can either become insensitive or become much more deeply sensitive in such a situation. Obviously, Moshe took the latter path. His work tending flocks led to his career tending the flock of a nation, caring about each and every one, concerned for the welfare of the individual, not just the collective. His desire for sanctity, his willingness to act when the situation warranted it, are teachable moments for all of us in good times and in challenging times like these past 2 years. This period in history is not like anything we've ever experienced in our lives. One would have to be well over 100 years even to recall the last global pandemic. Still, we know that our ability and our legacy bequeathed to us by the patriarchs and matriarchs, whom we studied in Genesis, concluding last week, and Moshe, and the righteous women who abound in this week's portion, stands us in good stead to meet the demands of the time with courage, with kindness, with humility, and with holiness. Good Shabbos.